Alicia Johnson was denied a loan from First National Bank, not because of her skills or credit, but simply because of who she was. Carl Whitman, the loan officer, dismissed her potential with a polite smile that barely hid his condescension. But Alicia turned the tables overnight, securing private investors and buying the very building the bank had refused to fund. Just wait until you see how she transformed rejection into triumph, and why justice ultimately prevailed in this unforgettable story. Alicia Johnson pushed open the glass doors of First National Bank, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned lobby with a sense of purpose that only comes from months of preparation. It was a bright Monday morning, and the sunlight spilling across the marble floors seemed to promise new beginnings, yet a knot of tension twisted in her stomach. She had spent weeks perfecting her loan proposal, scrutinizing every number, every line of text, ensuring her projections were airtight. Her startup, a small but innovative tech company focused on sustainable energy solutions, had already started to attract attention in local business circles. Today, she wasn't just a hopeful entrepreneur. She was a professional, a strategist, and a visionary, ready to take her company to the next level. As she approached the reception desk, Alicia's pulse quickened with anticipation. She had an appointment with Carl Whitman, a loan officer whose reputation for strictness preceded him. She hoped that professionalism and evidence would be enough to convince him. But as soon as she was led into his office, a subtle shift in the air told her something wasn't right. Carl stood and extended a hand with a practiced smile. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he said. There was a warmth in his voice, but Alicia sensed a hidden edge beneath it, a carefully calibrated politeness that felt more like an obstacle than a greeting. She set her portfolio on the desk and began to present her business plan, her words steady but passionate. She spoke of her company's innovative products, the market research she had conducted, and the sustainable energy contracts that were already in discussion. She highlighted her personal financial stability, her spotless credit record, and the growth potential that any bank should find appealing. For 10 minutes, she outlined her projections with precision, anticipating questions, ready with answers. Then came the pause, long and deliberate, the kind that signals judgment is being passed in silence. Carl leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and Alicia felt it immediately. A subtle dismissal, a barrier she couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry, Miss Johnson," he finally said, his tone measured, almost gentle, "but your application has been denied." Alicia blinked. She had anticipated questions, requests for clarification, perhaps even suggestions for improvement. But a flat denial with no explanation, no constructive feedback? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She searched Carl's face for some hint of reasoning, but found only an unreadable neutrality that suggested her merits had barely been considered. The polite phrasing masked an uncomfortable truth, one that Alicia felt deep in her chest. This wasn't about numbers, projections, or potential. It was about perception, assumptions, and biases hidden beneath layers of corporate formality. Her chest tightened, a mix of disbelief and fury rising inside her like a tide that refused to be contained. The injustice of the moment struck her with full force, not only for herself, but for every capable woman and person of color who had ever been told, subtly or overtly, that their abilities weren't enough. Her hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging lightly into her palms as she struggled to maintain composure. She could feel the fire of indignation burning just beneath the surface, sharp and insistent. Alicia left the bank with a brisk, purposeful step, refusing to let the denial define her. The lobby's soft hum of chatter, the faint clatter of keyboards behind the teller stations, all faded into a blur. She felt the injustice like a physical weight pressing against her. But alongside it, a spark of determination began to ignite. This was not the end of her story. The fire inside her, fueled by the unfairness she had just experienced, promised that her response would be measured, deliberate, and powerful. Today's anger would not consume her. It would become the first step in turning the tables on a world that underestimated her. Every injustice has a price, and Alicia Johnson was already planning how she would see that price paid, not in revenge, but in triumph. The evening air was warm but heavy as Alicia Johnson walked up the steps of her apartment building, her mind still trapped in the sterile, brightly lit office of First National Bank. The sun had long dipped below the skyline, leaving behind streaks of amber and purple, but the beauty of the city's evening glow offered no comfort. She set her keys on the counter and sank into her favorite chair, her laptop still open with projections and financial charts that suddenly felt hollow. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, the questions, the objections, the polite negotiation, and yet reality had landed like a cold slap. Alicia's mind kept returning to Carl Whitman's smile, his carefully measured words, and the subtle, unspoken judgment that had hung in the room like a shadow. "I'm sorry, Ms. Johnson, but your application has been denied." It wasn't the words themselves that stung, it was the implication behind them. Every number, every plan, every achievement she had worked tirelessly to accumulate seemed to dissolve under that polite dismissal. She felt a deep, piercing humiliation, not just at being denied, but at being dismissed, as if her accomplishments, her skills, and her vision didn't exist. The weight of it settled over her like a storm cloud, pressing her shoulders down and making each breath feel heavier. She felt the sting of personal setback intertwining with the broader, invisible web of systemic bias she had faced her entire life. This denial was not just a rejection of a business plan. It was a subtle assertion that, to some, she did not belong in the spaces where major decisions were made. The injustice was intimate, yet impersonal, frustrating in its quiet cruelty. Alicia's fingers fidgeted with the edges of her notebook, and she could feel her chest tighten with the effort to hold back the swell of emotion. Finally, unable to bear the weight alone, she reached for her phone and called Marcus, her longtime friend and mentor. The line rang twice before his familiar voice came through, warm and steady. "Alicia, hey, how's it going?" he asked. She inhaled, trying to steady her voice, but the trembling leaked through anyway. It's worse than I imagined," she said. "It's more than a denial. It's like they don't even see me as a capable person." Her words hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. Marcus didn't interrupt. He let her speak, letting the flood of frustration and disappointment spill out. She recounted the encounter, every detail: the office, the smile, the polite tone, the unspoken dismissal, and with each word the humiliation sharpened. Alicia could feel the tears rising, not just for herself, but for every ambitious entrepreneur who had ever been silently pushed aside. The room seemed to shrink around her, the apartment walls closing in as if echoing the sense of confinement she felt in the broader world. The denial was a reminder that talent and hard work, even in abundance, were sometimes not enough to overcome invisible barriers. For a long while she sat in silence after the call, staring at the city lights outside her window. The weight of systemic bias, the sting of personal setback, and the realization of just how many doors were quietly closed to people like her pressed down on her heart. She questioned herself, her plans, her dreams, even her place in the world she had been so determined to change. Could her vision survive in a society that seemed designed to test her at every turn? Yet even within the heaviness, there was a quiet, simmering energy. Pain, Alicia realized, was a signal. It marked the moments when something mattered deeply, when injustice demanded a response. Though she felt shaken, the embers of determination had not been extinguished. The evening had been long and the storm cloud heavy, but somewhere beneath the surface, the first seeds of resilience were already beginning to take root. Alicia didn't yet know how she would turn the tide. All she knew was that the pain, though crushing, was undeniable proof that she was ready to fight, not tomorrow, not later, but beginning now. Alicia Johnson sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of her laptop filling the apartment as the city lights flickered through the window. The weight of the day's humiliation had been heavy, but exhaustion was no match for her restless mind. She could not, would not, let the bank's dismissal define her or her dreams. Determination surged quietly beneath the ache, a steady pulse reminding her that the fight was far from over. That night, she began to map every possible path forward, tracing networks of contacts, lenders, and investors with the precision of someone who had long been accustomed to solving problems under pressure. Her first step was research. She scoured databases of alternative lenders, searching for institutions willing to consider merit over perception. She looked into small investment groups and venture capital firms she had admired from afar, some of them known for backing underrepresented entrepreneurs. She revisited her contacts, sending carefully crafted messages that highlighted her achievements, her vision, and the growth potential of her startup. Each reply, even the ones that offered only polite interest, felt like a tiny spark of possibility. As the hours passed, Alicia's mind wandered beyond traditional funding avenues. She remembered a recurring frustration in her search for office space, her dream of moving into a building that would signal legitimacy and stability to her team and clients. Then, in a sudden flash of insight, she paused. The building she had been coveting for months, the one that had always seemed just out of reach, was owned by the very bank that had denied her loan. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. The same institution that had dismissed her potential now controlled the property that could define her company's next chapter. Alicia leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with strategy. If the bank would not support her, she would find investors who understood her vision and recognized her drive. Within the hour, she picked up the phone and called a private equity firm she had worked with previously. Her voice was calm, resolute, and focused. She outlined the opportunity, painting a picture of the building's potential, the growth trajectory of her startup, and her unwavering commitment to making it a success. On the other end, the investors listened intently, impressed not just by her numbers, but by her clarity, confidence, and determination. By morning, the deal was secured. Private investors had agreed to fund Alicia's acquisition, not as a favor, but because they believed in her vision and her ability to execute it. The sense of hope that had begun as a flicker overnight now burned brightly, replacing the shadow of the bank's dismissal with the vision of agency and power. The same building that had once seemed unattainable was now within her grasp. When Alicia walked into the building the next day, it was not as a tenant hoping for approval, but as the owner, a quiet thrill coursing through her. The polished floors, the tall windows, the open-plan offices, everything she had imagined was now hers to shape, to command, to grow. The irony was not lost on her. The very bank that had rejected her had inadvertently set the stage for her triumph. She could almost hear the echo of Carl Whitman's polite words, now rendered powerless against the momentum she had built. Every step she took through the building was infused with a mixture of exhilaration and quiet vindication. Hope had transformed into action, pain into strategy, and determination into tangible results. Alicia realized that her vision, her persistence, and her refusal to be diminished had opened doors that no rejection could close. This was more than a professional milestone. It was a personal affirmation that her capabilities, ingenuity, and drive were undeniable. By the time she returned to her apartment that evening, Alicia's heart was lighter, her mind alive with plans for expansion, team growth, and new projects. The spark of hope that had ignited in the dark hours of the previous night had grown into a blaze, illuminating possibilities she had only dared to imagine before. She knew challenges would continue, obstacles would emerge, But for the first time since the bank's rejection, she felt untouchable in her purpose, ready to turn the next chapter into something extraordinary. The morning sun glinted off the glass facade of the building as Alicia Johnson arrived, her keys in hand, her heart steady with a quiet confidence that had been hard-won. The lobby, once a distant aspiration, now carried the weight of her determination and the unmistakable stamp of achievement. She had envisioned this moment countless times in the weeks since the bank's rejection, but seeing it in reality brought a surge of exhilaration that words could scarcely capture. Today, she was not a hopeful entrepreneur pleading for validation. She was the owner, the architect of her own success, and a living testament to resilience. Meanwhile, news traveled quickly. Carl Whitman, the loan officer who had denied her application, received a call from a colleague in the city's business circle. His brow furrowed as he listened, disbelief etched into his expression. The same woman he had dismissed, whose proposal he had deemed unworthy without explanation, had bought the very building he had thought was beyond her reach. For the first time, Carl had to confront the reality that his judgment had been incomplete, clouded by bias rather than merit. It was a humbling, if silent, acknowledgment that talent and determination could not be contained by narrow perception. Alicia stepped into the office floor, sunlight streaming through the expansive windows, illuminating the bustling activity of her team. Desks were being arranged, computers set up, and the atmosphere buzzed with quiet energy and anticipation. She paused for a moment, surveying the space, letting herself feel the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Every corner of the office, every cubicle and conference room was a reminder that she had turned systemic injustice into a tangible victory. This was more than a business expansion. It was a reclaiming of agency, a reassertion of capability, and proof that resilience could transform obstacles into milestones. As she walked through the rooms, Alicia reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the denial, the humiliation, the doubts. All of it had been fuel, igniting a determination that refused to be extinguished. She had navigated alternative funding paths, leveraged networks of supporters, and identified opportunities invisible to those blinded by convention. Each challenge had strengthened her, each setback had clarified her vision, and each moment of perseverance had built the foundation for this triumph. Outside the walls of her startup, the story began to ripple through the city. Local business networks buzzed with admiration and respect. Entrepreneurs who had faced similar barriers found inspiration in Alicia's approach. Her ability to turn rejection into opportunity, her refusal to accept limitations imposed by others, and her strategic acumen in seizing control of her own destiny. Media outlets covered the acquisition with a tone of celebration, framing her not just as a successful businesswoman, but as a symbol of determination and ingenuity in the face of systemic challenges. Alicia's victory was both personal and universal. It spoke to the power of persistence, the value of strategic thinking, and the importance of refusing to let external prejudice dictate one's path. In her quiet moments, she reflected on how far she had come, recognizing that her story had become a beacon for others who struggled against barriers they did not deserve. The lesson was clear. When injustice tries to hold you down, courage, clarity, and calculated action can overturn even the most entrenched obstacles. As the day drew to a close, Alicia paused in her new office, looking out over the city skyline. Her mind was alive with plans for the future, for innovation, growth, and mentorship. She had achieved more than ownership of a building. She had transformed a moment of rejection into a platform for inspiration. The building was not just a space for her startup, it was a symbol of triumph over doubt, a monument to resilience, and a living reminder that vision and determination could not be denied. Alicia Johnson had won more than a property. She had reclaimed belief in herself and sent a clear message to the world. Injustice can be met not with resignation, but with unwavering resolve, and in that resolve lies the power to turn the world upside down.